Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, it's pretty simple. We take this huge stack of source material, all the articles and data that you've shared with us.
And we try to distill it.
We do. We try to pull out the most compelling, the most counterintuitive, and the most essential nuggets of knowledge. And today we are deep diving into a place that's often called the land of Lincoln.
The prairie state.
Right. But it's fundamentally, I think, a perfect, complicated microcosm of the entire American experience, Illinois.
It really is an ideal subject for a deep dive, mainly because of those contradictions. I mean, Illinois represents the whole American journey.
From ancient civilizations to
industrial might, from agricultural wealth, all the way to global finance. So yeah, we're going to try and synthesize its complex geography, its deep, often violent history, its powerful economy.
If largest, right.
If largest GDP, yeah. And its perpetually paradoxical political and demographic makeup.
And when you look at the fundamentals, you realize pretty fast, this isn't just another state. This is an absolute powerhouse sitting, right in the middle of the country.
It is.
We're talking about the 6th largest population in the U.S. and maybe more tellingly, that 5th largest gross domestic product.
Yeah.
If Illinois were its own country, it would be a top 20 economy in the world. Yeah. Easy.
And that massive economic weight, it comes directly from its position. It's the absolute linchpin of the Midwest and the Great Lakes region.
Geographically, it's just perfectly placed.
Perfectly. It borders Lake Michigan, which is critical for shipping. You've got Wisconsin to the north, and then its western and southern boundaries are literally defined by the country's greatest rivers.
The Mississippi.
The mighty Mississippi to the west, and then the confluence of the Wabash and Ohio rivers down south. This pivotal location is really the key to understanding why everything from rail to air travel routes through Illinois today.
Before we get into the really deep history, let's just quickly touch on the name Illinois. Because I think everyone who grew up there probably heard the same myth about what it meant.
Oh, yeah.
But the real origin, our sources highlight, is it's a fascinating linguistic correction.
It's a great example of how historical misinterpretations just get cemented as fact. The state name is, of course, the modern French spelling for the Illinois Native Americans, the Illinois. For decades, American scholars claimed the name meant man or men.
That was the common wisdom, yeah. They linked it to the word Irinnuit.
They did, but that was a historical assumption. Modern linguistic analysis has pretty much debunked it. They've shown the actual word for man in the Miami, Illinois language is Irinnuit.
So a totally different word.
A different word. And the consensus now is way more interesting. The name Illinois actually comes from the Miami, Illinois verb Irenuawa.
Okay, so what does Irenuawa mean?
It translates to he speaks the regular way. Essentially, it was a way to distinguish people who spoke the accepted or common dialect from other groups.
So it's more about a shared language.
Exactly. It's an identity marker. That term passed through the Ojibwe language, becoming Illinois, and then the French just adopted that and applied their common spelling for the we sound, which is qua. So Illinois is really rooted in a linguistic self-identification, those who speak our tongue, not just a simple translation of man.
Okay, let's unpack the really deep roots of this state, because before the French, before any American settlers, Illinois was home to this massive, organized metropolis that I think completely redefines our idea of pre-Columbian America.
It's absolutely crucial context. The area around the Illinois River Valley has this staggering temporal depth. You've got the Coaster site, for instance, which has archaeological evidence of over 7,000 years of continuous human habitation.
7,000 years.
Yeah, continuous. It shows incredible adaptability. But the real headline grabber is Cahokia Mounds near modern-day Collinsville. This is the largest regional chiefdom of the pre-Columbian Mississippian culture.
And when we say Cahokia, we're talking about an actual planned urban center, right? Not just a bunch of villages.
Oh, absolutely. This scale puts it in the same league as early European or Mesopotamian cities. At its peak, around 1050 to 1350 AD, Cahokia's population might have hit 15,000, maybe as high as 40,000 if you include all its satellite towns.
Which would make it the largest city north of Mexico.
By far. The largest population center north of the massive empires of central Mexico. It had over 100 mounds, all arranged in a planned design that reflected their cosmology and their political structure.
And the centerpiece, the Grand Plaza. The size of that is almost impossible to grasp.
It really is. The Grand Plaza, their main public gathering space, covered 50 acres. You mentioned 35 football fields earlier, and that's the kind of visualization you need to even get your head around the scope of the public works here. This was a center for ritual, for trade, for political assembly.
And towering over all of that was Monk's Mound. Give us the dimensions on that, because it sounds like something from another continent.
It's the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in the Americas period. Monk's Mound stands 100 feet high and covers an astonishing 13.8 acres at its base.
All built by hand.
All by hand. They estimate it took 22 million cubic feet of earth, all moved in baskets over generations. And when it was topped with its massive ceremonial building, the peak would have been 150 feet above the plaza. This wasn't just a hill. It was a visible symbol of immense political power.
And that level of coordination, of specialized labor, it just speaks to a societal complexity that we rarely attribute to this region's ancient history.
Precisely. The archaeology reveals a highly stratified society. We find evidence of specialized crafts, finely crafted tools, elaborate ceramics, and, high-status materials like copper and shell engraving. These weren't just farmers. They were urban specialists, artisans, and a powerful religious and military elite.
But then this huge urban center just vanishes by the 15th century. What are the theories on why a civilization that powerful collapsed?
It was likely multifaceted. Environmental factors definitely played a role. They would have needed a ton of wood for construction and fuel, leading to deforestation and resource depletion.
But there was more to it than that.
Oh, yeah. Our sources also point to a huge increase in social stress. There's unsettling evidence from sites in the central Illinois River Valley that suggest high levels of intertribal warfare. 1/3 of all adult skeletons examined showed evidence of violent injuries.
1/3, wow.
Yeah, that's a clear indicator of severe social breakdown or intense external conflict.
So the remnants of this complex society eventually broke down into smaller groups, and those were the ones the Europeans first encountered.
Exactly. The main group was the Illinois Confederation, or the Illini, an alliance that numbered over 10,000 people. And it was into this landscape that the French arrived.
Marquette and Joliet.
Right. Jacques Marquette, a Jesuit missionary, and Louis Joliet, a French-Canadian explorer. They were the first to really map and document the Illinois River region back in 1673.
And this area became known as the Illinois country, part of New France. It sounds like the French saw its strategic value immediately.
They absolutely did. They established a presence very quickly, building Fort St. Louis on top of Starved Rock in 1682, and they kept posts all along the river systems. They used this territory as a crucial link between their holdings in Canada and their settlements down the Mississippi in Louisiana.
And this remained French territory for nearly a century.
Until 1763, when European politics intervened. The British won the 7 Years' War, and the territory east of the Mississippi was transferred over to Great Britain.
Which caused a bit of an exodus among the French settlers.
It did. A lot of the French who had put down roots in the Illinois country just refused to live under British rule, so they packed up and migrated across the Mississippi to Spanish-controlled territories, places like St. Genevieve and St. Louis in modern-day Missouri.
And then during the Revolutionary War, the Americans made their claim.
Right. In 1778, George Rogers Clark, leading a small force for Virginia, captured key British posts, including Kaskaskia. So Virginia claimed the whole territory. But after the war, Virginia ceded its claim to the new U.S. government, and the area just became part of the vast Northwest Territory.
Okay, now we get to what our sources call the most critical political maneuver in Illinois history. The boundary shift of 1818, right before statehood. A move of 51 miles sounds so minor, but it changes absolutely everything.
It's the difference between Illinois being just another agrarian landlocked state and becoming the logistical backbone of the entire continent. The original boundary set by the Northwest Ordinance would have put Illinois' northern border on the same latitude as the southern tip of Lake Michigan.
Meaning no lake access at all.
None. It would have completely excluded Illinois from the Great Lakes.
So who is the visionary behind this last-minute land grab?
That would be Nathaniel Pope, the Illinois delegate to Congress. When Illinois applied for statehood in 1818, Pope successfully lobbied to amend the bill. He argued very forcefully that the state needed to extend its border 51 miles north to 42 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. It was a purely strategic move.
What did that 51-mile extension actually give them?
It was a massive geographical and economic win. First, it added 8,500 square miles of valuable land. Second, it secured the lead mining region near Galena in the northwest. Third, it delivered almost 50 miles of Lake Michigan shoreline.
And maybe most importantly for the future, it fully encompassed the Chicago River system.
That was the linchpin. Pope and others saw the future in connecting the Great Lakes shipping network to the Mississippi River basin. And the key was the proposed Illinois and Michigan Canal.
Which would be impossible without the Chicago River.
Exactly. Without incorporating the river, Illinois would have no access point to start the canal and no port city on Lake Michigan. Had Pope failed, Chicago would almost certainly be part of Wisconsin today, and Illinois would have been fundamentally cut off from the dynamic trade flowing through the Great Lakes. It was a singular moment of foresight that basically guaranteed the state's industrial destiny.
So statehood arrives in 1818, built on that brilliant strategic land grab. But the first few decades were spent just trying to find a foothold, both geographically and politically. The capital, for instance, it moved around a lot.
A lot of early uncertainty there. Kaskaskia was the first capital, but it was quickly seen as too remote, too exposed on the Mississippi. They operated out of a small rented building. Then they shifted to Vandalia.
And they had to build 3 different buildings there.
3 separate capitol buildings between 1820 and 1837 because the state kept outgrowing them or, just deciding to move again.
And the final move, the one to Springfield, that seems to have been driven by one particularly influential legislator.
It was. In 1837, the move to the more centrally located Springfield was authorized, and it was largely thanks to the lobbying of a powerful group of legislators called the Long Nine, led by a young, ambitious guy from Sangamon County named Abraham Lincoln.
We mentioned earlier that Illinois was technically a free state under the Northwest Ordinance. But the reality on the ground was, well, it was a lot more complicated than that, especially with so many early settlers coming from the South.
This is a really dark and complex chapter of the state's history. While the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery, that ban was often just ignored for people who already held slaves. When Illinois became a state in 1818, there were about 900 people legally held as slaves, mostly in the southern counties along the Ohio River.
Which helps explain that Little Egypt nickname we'll get to.
It does.
So how did the state manage to avoid fully legalizing slavery, given that southern influence?
It took a massive focused political effort. In 1824, there was a major push to amend the state constitution to fully legalize slavery. Governor Edward Coles, who had actually freed his own inherited slaves when he moved to Illinois from Virginia, led a really successful campaign to block it.
And the voters rejected it.
They did. The residents voted against the extension of slavery, 6,640 to 4,972. It was a narrow, hard-fought victory that preserved the state's constitutional status as free.
But that victory didn't exactly extend rights or welcoming conditions to free Black individuals.
Far from it. The state had very strict racial codes. The 1848 state constitution even allowed for exclusionary laws. And in 1853, the legislature passed a notorious law championed by figures like John A. Logan, which prohibited all African Americans, free or enslaved, from settling in the state.
What happened if they did?
If they were caught residing in Illinois, they could be fined, arrested, or even sold into temporary servitude just to pay their fines. It was an incredibly hostile environment that really shows the stark contrast between legal freedom and societal prejudice.
And while they were grappling with all these political and moral issues, the pioneers were also facing just relentless natural hardship. The stories of those early winters are absolutely brutal.
They really define the frontier struggle. 2 events stand out as almost legendary markers of hardship. The Winter of the Deep Snow in 1830-31, where a massive, sudden snow event blanketed the state and trapped settlers, leading to widespread famine.
And then there was the Winter of the Sudden Freeze.
Yeah, in 1836, temperatures dropped so fast that livestock and even travelers were reportedly frozen solid right where they stood. These winters became the defining benchmarks of resilience for the next century of settlers.
And that nickname, Little Egypt, which is still used for southern Illinois, that comes from one of those periods of natural disaster.
It does. It goes back to the biblical story of Joseph providing grain during a famine. During some of the early, really harsh crop failures in the 1820s and 30s, the northern parts of the state suffered terribly.
But the South was okay.
Southern Illinois, because of its slightly warmer climate and proximity to the rivers, often had better harvests. They shipped their surplus grain north to feed the starving population, and that's how the region earned the nickname Little Egypt. It really highlights the regional differences that have always been there.
The early 1830s also marked the final organized confrontation with the indigenous people who had occupied the land for millennia.
That would be the Black Hawk War of 1832. This conflict was basically the final armed attempt by Native American tribes, mainly the Sauk and Fox, led by Chief Black Hawk, to resist displacement and reclaim their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi.
Lands they had lost in a pretty questionable treaty.
A highly disputed 1804 treaty, yeah. The U.S. militia, backed by allied tribes, decisively defeated Black Hawk's forces. The remaining survivors were forced west into Iowa. This war formally ended significant Native American armed resistance in northern Illinois and just cleared the path for unchecked American settlement and the growth of Chicago.
And then there's this really bizarre interruption in Illinois' growth story, Nauvoo. It's so strange to think that at one point, this religious utopia was briefly bigger than the city that would become Chicago.
It's one of those amazing footnotes in history. Nauvoo, founded by Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints in 1839 on the Mississippi, was an economic and social phenomenon. Through sheer dedication and organization, the city grew explosively.
And by 1844, it was the biggest city in the state.
By 1844, it had a population of around 12,000, which, yes, temporarily surpassed Chicago.
But that reign was incredibly short.
It collapsed the same year its founder was killed. Joseph Smith and his brother were murdered in 1844 in nearby Carthage jail, which led to a succession crisis and immense persecution. Under Brigham Young's leadership, the vast majority of the Saints began their historic migration west to Utah, and Nauvoo just rapidly declined, leaving the path wide open for Chicago's rise.
And Chicago's rise was, as we established, all about logistics. How quickly did it go from a small port town to the undisputed national hub?
It was an exponential rise, completely driven by strategic infrastructure. The city was incorporated in 1833. But its real takeoff started with the opening of the Illinois and Michigan Canal in 1848.
Fulfilling Nathaniel Pope's vision.
Exactly. 30 years later, the canal connected the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River Basin, allowing goods to flow seamlessly from the East Coast all the way down to New Orleans.
And then the railroads just magnified that effect tenfold.
Oh, completely. By the 1860s, Chicago had established itself as the single most critical railroad junction in North America. Every major line went through it. This central nexus drove industrial growth in meatpacking, lumber, grain processing.
Yeah.
It made Chicago the fastest-growing city in the world for a time.
This industrial might then made Illinois strategically indispensable during the Civil War.
Absolutely indispensable. The state contributed over 250,000 soldiers, ranking fourth among all Union states. And crucially, the southern geography played a huge role. The city of Cairo, at the absolute southern tip where the Ohio meets the Mississippi, became the Union Army's most important strategic supply base.
And generals like Grant used it as a launchpad.
Exactly. Grant used Cairo as a base of operations to control the river systems, which were the main invasion route into the Confederacy.
As all these factories and mines exploded across the state, especially the coal fields in central and southern Illinois, the state also became a major stage for the American labor movement.
The growth came with intense friction. Illinois is home to some of the most profound and often violent episodes in American labor history. You have the Haymarket Riot in 1886 in Chicago, which became a massive setback for the 8-hour-day movement.
And then there was the Pullman strike a bit later.
The Pullman strike of 1894 was arguably even more significant because of the federal intervention. It began when workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company protested drastic wage cuts. The strike paralyzed rail traffic across the nation.
And the federal government stepped in?
President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops to break the strike. It resulted in violence, and it really cemented the federal government's willingness to use force against organized labor. These events solidified Illinois' identity as a state where industrial power was constantly being contested by the workers who built it.
And finally, the ultimate dramatic punctuation mark on that 19th century boom, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871.
A truly catastrophic event. The fire destroyed 4 square miles of the heart of Chicago, just consuming all the wooden structures built too quickly during that boom. But while it was devastating, it wasn't an end. It was a furious catalyst.
A chance to rebuild.
Exactly. The city used the disaster to redesign, modernize, and rebuild with steel and stone, which led directly to the architectural golden age that defined the modern Chicago skyline and its continued growth.
As we move into the 20th century, Illinois continued to be this magnet for growth. It hit 12.4 million people by the year 2000. And this influx of people drove a huge transformation in culture and infrastructure.
The demographic engine of the 20th century was really twofold. First, you had the continued European immigration that had characterized the 19th century German, Polish, Irish populations filling the cities. Second, and crucially, was the African American Great Migration.
which changed the face of Chicago.
It established a large, politically and culturally foundational black community, centered overwhelmingly in Chicago.
And the state kept solidifying its role as the ultimate national logistics center, just leveraging every physical advantage it had.
That geographic strategy that Nathaniel Pope initiated came to full fruition in the mid-20th century. The 1959 opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, coupled with the Illinois waterway system, means Chicago has dual access to global shipping.
To the Atlantic and the Gulf.
Exactly. It connects to the Atlantic Ocean via the Great Lakes and to the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi River system. This duality makes the Port of Chicago completely unique and indispensable.
If the railroads were the 19th century veins, I guess air travel became the 20th century arteries. O'Hare International Airport is a monument to this.
O'Hare's dominance is hard to overstate. It was built for the jet age, and it quickly became the world's busiest airport, a title it held from 1962 all the way to 1998.
And it's still one of the busiest today.
It is. Even if it's often surpassed by Atlanta in passenger volume, it remains a top global hub, a primary base for both United and American Airlines, linking the central U.S. to every major world market.
What's so fascinating to me is that while logistics defined its economic muscle, Illinois also became ground zero for the scientific revolution that defined the modern world, the birth of the nuclear age.
That whole transformation began in secrecy and science. In 1942, deep beneath the University of Chicago's Stagg Field, the world's first artificial self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction took place.
Chicago Pile 1.
That's the one. The conceptual and physical start of the Manhattan Project and the entire nuclear era. That moment permanently cemented Illinois' role in global history.
And this wasn't just a historical footnote. It evolved into a massive, ongoing industrial and research complex.
It created a direct lineage of scientific infrastructure that's still here today. Argonne National Laboratory, founded just west of the city, activated the U.S.'s first experimental nuclear power generating system in 1957. Later, in Batavia, Fermilab opened its massive particle accelerator.
Which was the biggest in the world for decades.
For over 40 years, yeah. This shows an immense, sustained state commitment to high-energy physics and atomic research.
And on the commercial side, Illinois is just dominated by nuclear power.
It leads all states in total nuclear capacity and generation. By 2007, nearly half, 48% of the state's total electricity came from its 11 commercial nuclear reactors. That is an astounding reliance.
And it creates other infrastructure needs.
It does. The fact that the Morris operation is the country's only de facto long-term high-level radioactive waste storage site just underlines how central Illinois is to America's atomic present and future.
Let's pivot to the physical state itself. When people think of Illinois, they just think flat. But the topography actually has significant variation that shapes its regional identity.
Right. The state is mostly within the interior plains, which gives it that classic prairie look. But there are crucial differences. In the extreme northwest, you have the rugged, unglaciated terrain of the driftless area.
Which is where the highest point is.
That's where Charles Mound, the state's highest point, reaches 12,235 feet. And you contrast that with the far south near Cairo, where the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers creates the lowest elevation point at just 279 feet. That range of nearly 1,000 feet defines microclimates and regional economies.
And to really understand the politics and the culture, you have to understand the state's three distinct geographical and cultural divisions.
These three divisions explain so much of the state's internal tensions. First, you've got Northern Illinois, or Chicagoland. That's the city and the 6 surrounding collar counties.
And that's where most of the people are.
About 65% of the state's population lives there. It's a dense, diverse, cosmopolitan, and wealthy economic engine.
Second, Central Illinois, the heart of Illinois.
This is your historical agricultural prairie. A vast swath of fertile land with medium-sized cities like Peoria, the capital Springfield, and the academic center of Champaign-Urbana. It's economically tied to farming, manufacturing, and state government.
And finally, Southern Illinois, or Little Egypt.
This region has a really distinct identity. It borders Missouri and Kentucky. It shares a warmer, more humid subtropical climate, and it features more rugged terrain. It also contains the Metro East area, which is geographically and economically tied to St. Louis. It feels in many ways like a gateway to the South.
And the term downstate, which you hear all the time, it seems to just mean not Chicago, But it's more about political identity than actual geography.
That's exactly it. While geographically downstate is south of Chicago, culturally and politically, it refers to everything outside the Chicagoland sphere of influence. A staunchly Republican rural voter in Rockford or DeKalb, which are geographically northern, will often call themselves downstate because they feel culturally and politically aligned against the metropolitan machine of Chicago. It's a term of political demarcation.
The climate itself also reflects that central position, making it susceptible to some really devastating weather extremes.
Being so deep in the continent, Illinois gets significant temperature swings, hot, humid summers, and very cold winters. But the most alarming factor is its vulnerability to tornadoes. The state averages about 54 tornadoes a year.
And you can't talk about Illinois weather without mentioning the tri-state tornado.
Impossible. The tri-state tornado of 1925 remains the deadliest single tornado in U.S. history. It killed 695 people across 3 states, but 613 of those deaths happened in Illinois alone. It left a permanent scar on the memory of the southern and central regions.
Moving to the economic engine, we know the state is agricultural, but the scale is just incredible.
Illinois is a global agricultural superpower. It's consistently first or second in soybean production and second in corn, yielding over 1.5 billion bushels of corn every year. That vast output underpins the whole economy of central Illinois. You see that heritage in companies like John Deere, headquartered in Moline.
But it's also a major manufacturing state.
The fourth most productive manufacturing state, though the economic shift towards high-value services centered in Chicago is undeniable.
And those high-value services mean finance and logistics.
Right. Chicago is the global center for derivatives trading, home to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. It started as a market for agricultural futures, but now handles complex financial instruments worldwide. Law, medicine, tech, logistics, it all clusters heavily there, driving the vast majority of the state's GDP.
Okay, let's dive into what you call the most astonishing economic contradiction. The coal paradox. Illinois is sitting on geological wealth, but it imports energy.
This is maybe the most glaring paradox of all. Illinois has an estimated 211 billion tons of bituminous coal. According to the Illinois State Geological Survey, the total heating value of this reserve is greater than the estimated oil deposits in the entire Arabian Peninsula.
That's an incredible amount of energy.
It is one of the world's great energy reserves.
So why aren't they running their power plants on that cheap local fuel?
The chemical composition is the problem. Illinois coal is notoriously high in sulfur, and when you burn high sulfur coal, it releases large amounts of sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain, and is subject to really stringent federal environmental regulations.
And the power plants aren't equipped for it.
Many of the older Illinois power plants lack the sophisticated equipment, the scrubbers, needed to process those high-sulfur coal emissions efficiently or affordably.
So it's actually cheaper to ship coal across the country than to scrub their own.
Precisely. It became far more cost-effective for Illinois utilities to import millions of tons of low-sulfur coal from Wyoming's Powder River Basin. So most of the coal produced in Illinois is exported to other places that have the right technology, while Illinois itself imports cleaner coal.
Which has devastated local mining towns.
Absolutely, the ones that relied on selling their fuel domestically.
And offsetting this fossil fuel reality, Illinois has also become a leader in biofuels, connecting back to that corn dominance.
It has. The state ranks third in the U.S. for ethanol production. The global leader in corn ethanol, Archer Daniels Midland, is headquartered in Illinois. The state has fully embraced converting its agricultural product into fuel, further diversifying its energy portfolio.
Okay, before we move on to politics, we should touch on the tax environment, which is complex and often characterized by high rates.
Illinois has a very difficult fiscal position. It relies on a flat personal income tax and a relatively high corporate tax. The sales tax is high, too. Chicago has one of the highest combined rates for a major U.S. city. And on top of that, the state has the second highest rate of real estate tax in the entire country.
Which is an immense burden on property owners.
It is, and it's the trade-off. Illinois has the third most interstate mileage in the U.S. and the most primary interstates passing through it, 13 of them. But it also ranks high in miles of toll roads, which just shows the high cost of maintaining that central hub status. The attempted fix to broaden the tax base, the graduated income tax proposal, failed in 2020. Which is the perfect segue to the state's deep political divides.
Let's turn our attention to the people and the politics, because this is where Illinois truly lives up to its billing as a microcosm of America. It is, you could argue, the Midwest's most diverse state.
The demographics reflect decades of both internal migration and global immigration. And while the population dipped slightly in the 2020 census, that diversity is foundational. It leads to stark cultural and economic contrasts, often clustered geographically. Cook County, home to Chicago, is the only majority-minority county in the state.
Let's break down the major groups, starting with the Hispanic and Latino population.
They're the largest minority group in Illinois, about 19.0% of the state. And a crucial detail here is their origin. Over 75% of the Hispanic population is Mexican American. That gives Illinois the largest population of Mexican descent outside of the western United States.
And they're concentrated mostly in Chicagoland.
Mostly, yes. Suburban Kane County, just west of Cook, has the highest concentration at 33.5%. But despite their numbers, this group faces really severe economic challenges. They report the lowest per capita income of any major group in the state, around $28,541.
Next, the Black and African American population, the second largest minority group.
They make up about 13.3% of the state. And while the majority live in Chicagoland, they are heavily concentrated in specific areas, largely due to historical and ongoing residential segregation.
Our sources highlighted a really alarming statistic about that segregation.
Yes. The Chicago metropolitan area has the third highest level of black-white residential segregation among major metro areas in the entire country. And this is a profound structural issue that concentrates poverty and limits opportunities, mostly on the south and west sides of Chicago and in specific south suburbs.
But the Black population is also historically important down in southern Illinois, right?
That's correct. The Little Egypt region, especially Pulaski and Alexander counties, has a significant Black population, around 32% in both counties. Economically, this community carries the highest overall poverty rate in the state at 23%.
And moving to the fastest growing demographic.
Asian Americans. Making up 7.1% of the population, the Asian American community is also the most affluent. They have the highest per capita income of any group in the state, at $54,122. The largest groups are Indian, Filipino, and Chinese. And what's interesting is their geographical concentration.
That's not in the city.
Right. The highest share is in suburban DuPage County, where they represent almost 15% of the population.
And then finally, a word on the European ancestry that still forms the numerical majority.
German ancestry is the single largest group at 15.8%, spanning both northern and southwestern Illinois. And Illinois has the largest Polish-American population of any state, over 750,000 residents, largely in Chicago. We also see a significant Middle Eastern population, including the largest Palestinian population in the U.S., clustered in the southern Chicago suburbs.
When you look at those income figures, the racial income inequality just leaps off the page. Asian and white incomes are nearly double that of Black and Hispanic residents. And this stark economic disparity, it feeds directly into the political landscape, which has undergone a radical transformation.
It really has. For decades, Illinois was a political bellwether. It often voted for the national presidential winner. Today, that's gone. Illinois is now a solid, non-negotiable Democratic stronghold, part of the national blue wall.
So what exactly drove that decisive shift from bellwether to blue bastion?
It really boils down to suburban realignment. The Democratic dominance starts with overwhelming votes from Cook County, of course, but the real change came from the collar counties: DuPage, Lake, Will, McHenry, and Kane. These wealthy, educated suburbs were historically the bedrock of the Republican Party in Illinois.
And they just started shifting left. Why?
As the National Republican Party embraced more socially conservative positions, these affluent, educated, and increasingly diverse suburban voters started prioritizing social issues. They broke away from traditional fiscal conservatism, and that cemented Democratic control statewide. This polarization is the engine of the state's modern politics, and it has completely isolated the heavily Republican rural downstate region.
You feel politically powerless.
Completely dominated by Chicago.
Yeah. Despite that current polarization, Illinois still boasts an impressive presidential pedigree.
An incredibly strong one. 3 U.S. presidents were elected while they were residents of Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, obviously, Ulysses S. Grant, who was living in Galena when he ran, and Barack Obama, who launched his career in Chicago.
Not to mention Ronald Reagan was born there and Hillary Clinton grew up there.
Exactly. Illinois has had this outsized role in supplying national leaders.
Okay, now we have to get to the state's most infamous calling card: its pervasive and persistent history of political corruption. It's almost a character in itself in Illinois.
It is deeply embedded, almost cyclical. The state has an unparalleled record of high-profile corruption that has led to a profound public cynicism about government. We've seen some incredible examples, even very recently.
The successive convictions of two governors are the most staggering examples.
Absolutely unprecedented. You had former Governor George Ryan, a Republican, convicted of racketeering and fraud. Then his Democratic successor, Rod Blagojevich, was impeached, removed from office, and convicted on federal corruption charges for, among other things, trying to sell Barack Obama's vacant Senate seat.
Two consecutive governors, convicted and imprisoned. It speaks to a structural problem.
And the cycle isn't new. It has deep historical roots. It's a pattern that goes back over a century. We can talk about Congressman Dan Rostenkowski, Governor Otto Kerner Jr., State Auditor Orville Hodgel served time for financial crimes. Historically, the machine politics, particularly in Chicago, relied on patronage and pay-to-play schemes that just became institutionalized.
And that culture is often maintained by powerful political dynasties.
Dynasties thrive in Illinois. The Stevenson family, 4 generations of politicians. The Daley family effectively controlled Chicago for over 40 years. More recently, you have the Pritzker family, who produced the current governor, and the Madigan family, with Michael Madigan serving as the powerful Speaker of the House for decades.
Let's pivot to infrastructure, starting with education, which is another area defined by really stark inequity.
The issue here is fundamentally structural, and it's tied directly to those high property tax rates we discussed. Illinois schools are funded primarily by local property taxes, not by substantial equalized state contributions. And this creates enormous wealth disparities between districts.
What does that disparity look like on the ground?
In affluent suburban districts, like in DuPage County, the high property values generate massive tax revenue, so per pupil spending soars. They get superior facilities, resources, teachers. Conversely, inner city or deeply rural, downstate districts with lower property values struggle immensely. They have significantly lower per pupil spending. One study called Illinois, despite its wealth, the stingiest in its support for education.
In attempts to fix it, have failed.
They've been stymied by opposition from the wealthy communities who fear their local control and funding advantages would be diluted. This persistent inequity is one of the state's biggest long-term challenges.
And yet, despite that structural challenge, Illinois is home to some truly world-class academic institutions.
The list is formidable. The University of Chicago and Northwestern University are consistently ranked among the world's elite. The University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign is celebrated globally, especially for its engineering school. So you have this paradox of systemic funding inequity coexisting with these beacons of elite academic excellence.
And finally, let's circle back to its lifeblood, transportation.
Illinois is still the undisputed national crossroads. As we noted, third most interstate mileage, the most primary interstates running through it. Crucially, Chicago is the nation's largest and most active freight rail hub, where all 6 Class I railroads meet. This dense network air, rail, water, road ensures that Illinois continues to be the essential logistics engine driving the national economy.
And tying that strong metropolitan identity together is the state's rich sports culture.
Sports provide this unifying identity for Chicagoland that projects nationally. You've got 2 MLB teams, the Cubs and the White Sox, the Bears, the Blackhawks, and of course the iconic Chicago Bulls, whose Michael Jordan-era dominance really shaped global basketball culture. And beyond the pros, you have 13 NCAA Division I programs with the Fighting Illini and Northwestern Wildcats in the Big Ten.
We've traveled from the ancient power of Cahokia through that strategic engineering of the 51-mile border shift that created Chicago, into the heart of American industrialization, the birth of the nuclear age, and the complexities of modern demographics.
And what emerges from this deep dive is a state that's really defined by these magnificent contradictions, the city of contrasts. It has the massive economic output of the 5th largest GDP, driven by immense diversity and high-value services, yet at the same time, it's hampered by a structural political culture of persistent corruption, severe residential segregation, and deep unresolved internal political and fiscal turmoil.
And that leads us directly to the final thought we want to leave you with, one that really encapsulates the state's central paradox. We establish that the state's wealth and political power are concentrated overwhelmingly in the Chicagoland area, a region that relies on high-value services and votes overwhelmingly Democratic.
Right. And conversely, the vast geographic expanse, downstate Illinois, remains heavily Republican and economically tied more to agriculture and these distressed resource sectors like high-sulfur coal mining.
This profound geographic and economic chasm really came to a head in 2020 when the state firmly rejected the proposed constitutional amendment to implement a graduated income tax. The arguments for it were about funding schools and easing the burden on the poor.
And the arguments against centered on a deep distrust of corrupt Springfield politicians and fear among high earners that they'd be taxed right out of the state. So given that the measure failed, preserving the status quo of high property taxes and inequitable school funding, what does this ongoing fiscal polarization reveal about the deep, unresolved cultural and economic identity crisis in the land of Lincoln? And what will be the catalyst that forces a political solution to reconcile the needs of its cosmopolitan core with those of its rural heartland? It's a question that really defines the state's future.